Hi folks, we're just given a few moments here at the start for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Tracy K. Smith presenting her new book, There's a Revolution Outside My Love, Letters from a Crisis. She'll be talking with contributors Gregory Pardlo and Major Jackson and moderator Julie Scelfo, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Tracy, Gregory, Major, Julie, and the team at Vintage and Anchor Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and interact with your fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the authors, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, There's a Revolution Outside My Love, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Tracy's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our moderator tonight is Julie Scelfo. She is a journalist, author, and former New York Times staff writer who advocates for social justice, media literacy, and radical empathy. She is the author of The Women Who Made New York, an inclusive, intersectional collection of biographies revealing how it was women, and not just men, who built one of the world's greatest cities. Scelfo is a frequent public speaker who has made numerous appearances on TV, radio, and podcasts, but her favorite medium is in-person dialogue, which is why she frequently conducts author interviews at the Mount, Edith Wharton's home in the Berkshires. When Scelfo's not writing, reporting, or chasing her three sons around Brooklyn on her scooter, she is a fellowship coach at the Op-Ed Project, an organization that works to amplify marginalized voices in the public sphere, thereby changing who writes history. She'll be speaking with our featured authors, Gregory Pardlo, Major Jackson, and Tracy K. Smith. Gregory Pardlo is the author of Digest, winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Digest was also nominated for an NAACP Image Award, named a standout book by the Academy of American Poets, a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year, and a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and Indie Fab Book of the Year. Gregory Pardlo's other awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. His first poetry collection, Totem, won the American Poetry Review Honickman First Book Prize in 2007. He is poetry editor of Virginia Quarterly Review and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 kids. Major Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Oops, and Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canon Poetry Prize for her first book of poems. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry 2019, Ring for Obama, and Library of America's County Cullen Collected Poems. A recipient of fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and National Endowment for the Arts, he has published poems and essays in American Poetry Review, The New Yorker, Plowshares, and several others. Major lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He's the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. Tracy K. Smith is the author of 4 acclaimed poetry collections: The Body's Question, Gwynday, Wade in the Water, and Life on Mars, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Most recently, she is the author of the memoir Ordinary Light, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. She has received a Writers Award and a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and currently teaches at Princeton University. Tonight's featured book, There's a Revolution Outside My Love, is a deeply profound anthology of writing filled with pain and beauty, warmth and intimacy. A remarkable feat of empathy, There's a Revolution Outside My Love offers solace in a time of swirling protest, change, and violence, reminding us of the human scale of the upheaval, and providing hope for a kinder future. Tracy, Gregory, and Major will be reading from the book and talking with Julie, and then they'll be talking with all of you. I'm now going to pass things off to our moderator, Julie Scelfo. Julie, please take it away.
Chelsea, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for everything you've done to make this event possible. And also thank you to Greenlight Books. I think I speak for everyone here tonight when I say how much we love and appreciate and need our independent bookstores, and I love Greenlight. So thank you for having us. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm so glad that you're able to be here. Before we get into it, I wanted to sort of give the audience an introduction to the book, because for me, it really is a most unusual book. There's so much rawness, there is so much realness, and so much beauty in these pages. I really couldn't get through the book without putting it down. I was just sort of forced to, after each essay or letter, I needed to take a break. I just couldn't absorb it all at the same time. So Tracy, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how you and John got the idea for this anthology and how it came together.
Yeah, well, John Freeman is here in this virtual space with us, so I want to shout out to him and his genius and sense of community and literary community really brings this book into being. And I think he was eager to find out from different imaginations what the year that we've, I feel like we haven't quite finished living through it, but this past year has brought to the surface. We witnessed many different converging crises. And so each of us had a different or even sometimes multiple points of entry, and to think about what these different urgencies sound and feel like in different voices and vocabularies, some of which are thinking about COVID, others about racial justice, others about, different moments in this year that actually, began generations ago in our country's deep history. That was John's vision. And I feel really grateful to have been able to say, I will help. And here's some other voices that we can maybe think of drawing into this broad conversation. And so that's where we are. I think of it as a really honest way of telling history. You're right when you say that it feels raw. It feels like what is measuring these, testimonies is not distance necessarily, but something else. And it's really instructive to me to think about what these other questions, voices, memories, understandings of history, understandings of self and community can do to root me more deeply in the fullness of this country, really, you know.
There was so much happening and it was so difficult to process, I think, for everybody in different ways and different times. Did you read things and think they belong there, or did you reach out to, you and John, to reach out to writers that you know? And as you did that, I'm just curious, was it business as usual, or did you find yourself sort of having to be more intentional or more careful with your requests given what everybody was facing?
Well, I think that it's both. There are some pieces like Reginald Dwayne Betts's piece, for example, that appeared and seemed like they needed to be drawn into this space. But I think most of the contributions were the result of saying, okay, what would you want to say from this moment? What would you want to say to America? And inviting people to respond to that in different ways, as you know, Major and Greg have done, I've done. And so part of the curation had to do with thinking about capturing the right cross-section, right? Is it geographical? Is it generational? Is it through different forms? Is it through different preoccupations? And what I think happened is it's all of those things in different ways. And the overlap is also really interesting too.
So interesting. I mean, some of the pieces really took sort of a broad or intersectional view of what was happening. Others were looking at the experiences of Black people in America specifically. Greg, you wrote a letter to Juneteenth that was as much about homeschooling your daughter as it was about our collective historical amnesia. Would you read an excerpt to us?
Absolutely. Yeah, arguably, these are pretty much the same things. Certainly education and our history are very big flashpoints in the news lately. So the letter to Juneteenth, I guess that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm skipping through, so hopefully this will make sense in the end. Dear Juneteenth, this year, in addition to you, we also met COVID-19, which means, like everyone else's, my kid was homebound for most of the school year. The two of us were at leisure to think about you as a historical marker and as a call to reflection, or at least I was. The morning of your arrival found her throwing some plush toy at the door in my direction. I was trying to tell her about the history of Texas, to tell her that the Republic of Texas seceded from Mexico because Mexico had abolished slavery. What do I care about Texas? Is all I could pick out from the words muffled by the duvet she pulled over her head. If you would come on a normal school day, Juneteenth, I like to think she'd care about Texas. By that hour of the morning, she would already have made the 45-minute subway ride from Brooklyn to the west side of Manhattan and have been sitting in her 9th grade classroom bursting with questions about Texas. Instead, she's developed a habit of sleeping late and attending, if you count the soundless square displaying her initials as attendance, the optional late morning Zoom session some of her teachers offered for an hour each day before she drifted off into a miasma of headphones and group chats. Things were not normal. In the quarantine weeks before you arrived, most mornings, including weekends, a school bell would ring in my mind, then I'd leap from bed in a panic. A mashup of climate anxiety and virus anxiety made a further mashup with my fear of failing my kids, and together, all of it revised that old nightmare where I walk into a classroom to discover I'm the only one who doesn't know we're having a major exam. In this version of the nightmare, however, my performance on the exam will determine the physical, financial, and emotional health of my descendants for the next 7 generations. That's enough to drive me to turn every space in our home into a makeshift classroom. My kids now avoid me, and they're not at all subtle about it. Until this year, my oldest daughter had spent her entire educational life at a tiny independent school where she knew every student, teacher, administrator, staff member, in some cases their extended families. This was her first year outside the glass bubble, as she called it. This year, she switched to a public school for multiple reasons, most of them, I suspect, having to do with race. Only recently, she told her mother and me that once in 6th grade, some boys in her class asked her permission to use the N-word. Apparently, they held Black culture in such high esteem that their thirst for Blackness would not be slaked until they could roll that obscenity on their tongues. They called it privileges, a kind of borrowed Blackness that only a Black person could bestow. Only my daughter, that is, as the lone person of color in the class, could do these honors. The irony that these most privileged children would amplify that privilege by leveraging cultural sensitivity against the one person it was intended to protect, that may have been lost on the children at the time, but it was a formative moment in all of their developing relationships to race and, of course, gender. The boys learned a toxic etiquette, the transactional logic that will always favor men and encourage them to trade on their privilege. One day, very soon after all of this, my daughter will be emancipated. How am I preparing her for that day? Will I be ready to let her go? The patriarch in me half wants to hide this fact from her somehow. Selfishly, sure, but also because I still think of her as the bug-eyed baby I have to protect from the world. It was her idea to leave her old school. She'd figured out for herself what was best, and I admit I was a little threatened by the independence that move signaled. Had she stayed at her private school, she probably would not have acquired any tools for dealing with the racism she will continue to encounter. Systemic racism will only yield to a substantially opposing force like the one that has risen in response to the murder of George Floyd. If there had been no pandemic and classroom instruction hadn't been disrupted, would you, Juneteenth, have figured prominently in school curriculum? Probably not. The idea that Texas was so remote the news of emancipation couldn't reach them for 2.5 years is deceptive at best. Yet any historical narrative that challenges the image of America as a nation devoted to fairness and equality gets spun as slander in the larger culture. Sadly, I believe only the murder of George Floyd could have cleared a space at all for you or for my daughter in the public mind. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Talk to me about the idea that Juneteenth had taken shape enough that you were able to write about it.
Yeah, well, that was obviously that's the premise of the piece. I had, in all honesty, I think I had only heard of it a few times in my life and had never actually attached it to a particular history. You know, it just seemed it was the title of an Ellison novel. It was, you know, a kind of abstract reference to the idea of emancipation. But as I started thinking about it, well, as more people were talking about it, and as I became more conscious of how it became more upset at the fact that so few of us, myself included, knew so little, you know, about it, knew anything about it. I started thinking more about why that is. What are the forces that create that amnesia? I mean, it's intentional, right? And you know, just how that there are other pieces in or other kind of points in the piece that I glossed over, I stepped over, but like I said in the beginning, it has everything to do with education and how we protect our children and how we shape their idea of who they are. And so,
I mean, that's my next question to you, because, you know, I'm a parent too, and the challenges of last year with just so many endless moments of competing demands, you know, it was really challenging. And I felt your pain, you know, knowing that your child was like watching YouTube videos and chatting with their friends and not learning biology 101. But I just wonder if you could talk about parenting amidst the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter uprising, and whether you faced moments where you felt a conflict of duty in terms of parenting, being an activist, doing your work, and whatever other roles you might.
Oh yeah, no, it was all in conflict, and which is also to say, I think, fortunately, the upside of that is that the interconnectedness of all of those roles became really apparent too at the same time. And so yeah, my wife and I battled with each other and ourselves over whether or not to take our children down to the Barclays Center, right, in June. where could we march and feel confident that the kids would be safe, because I absolutely wanted them to see firsthand. I mean, and I'm also very conscious of the fact that in the context of COVID, this is their future, right? Their generation is being shaped by this moment. I am, I'm just a kind of witness to a history that is formative for them. So I also wanted to be respectful and honor the fact that both of my kids should have a sense of ownership over this moment in history. But of course, as you mentioned, there are the competing demands of TikTok and infiltrating the family culture, which is horrifying to me. But we survived. We
survived. Major, your contribution to the book is a letter not from Birmingham, but from Burlington, Vermont. Would you read an excerpt to us?
Sure. Let me just thank Tracy and John for pulling all these voices together. For some reason, I took myself back to the silent parade of 1917, July, in which it was an anti-lynching march. And I was thinking about how this anthology is its own kind of silent, quiet march, not silent in the literal sense, but there's something kind of beautiful in the collection of voices who kind of coexist side by side at this hour. I feel like it's a calm wake, let's put it that way. But I was thinking about how American this is, all of it. The marching, the racialized violence. I think later you're going to talk about Layli Long Soldier, so we have to talk about the width of violence across writ large, and the response. And what my piece wanted to do is kind of allude to the fact that while there are certain sectors of our society that might identify protest and resistance as anti-American, and I can't think of anything that's more American. So my piece wanted to kind of high five that brilliant generation, Dr. King, John Lewis, that civil rights generation, and maybe even kind of reach back to them and what it means for us, even during a pandemic, to kind of gather and assemble either on the page or in the streets. The piece also takes leap from a tweet that I saw by a mutual friend of ours. Let me just say we're all poets here on this panel tonight. But my friend Patrick Rosal tweeted Kevin Quashie's scholarship in relevance to the marching. So I'm gonna read just pieces. John, and John is John Freeman, who gave the assignment. John, when you gave me this epistolary assignment in the midst of the protest, I immediately reread Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail and sought out his phrase about direct action as presenting our very bodies as the means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. Followed by this gorgeous assertion: we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Juneteenth allows us to keep present in our hearts and minds the interrelatedness of our fates as free individuals. I think one of the arguments we miss out on making is that to say Black Lives Matter is to publicly acknowledge Black people's extraordinary contributions to the idea of America, for whom many have benefited, to keep within sight the history of struggle, not just for one set of people, but as King famously notes, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In this light, the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Rayshard Brooks, Michael Brown Jr., Philando Castile, George Floyd, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Tony McDade, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, so many in our lifetime by racialized violence and police brutality amount to a kind of involuntary Black martyrdom that gets us closer to an idealized society. That's a harsh sentence to write, and the phenomenon is wrong. We have to say no more. Political leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, artists of all disciplines, people who believe in beauty, decency, and justice, we have to rise above our massive ambivalence and say, no more Black deaths on the altar of our country. John, my dear brother, poet Patrick Rizal tweeted something that I cannot stop pondering. After reminding us of Kevin Quashie's wonderful scholarship on the inner lives of Black folk as its own beautiful sovereign space in his book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, Rizal wrote this: when allies fight for Black liberation, we are fighting for systemic change. But that systemic change is meant to protect the intimacy and interiority of Black life and Black lives. In practical terms, do not check in on your Black friends and expect them to process their feelings with you, or worse, that they will help you understand your feelings. If they need you, it will be in their time. The part of Black life that you don't actually see, that they don't share with you, is the part you must protect. This is no small coincidence. That is also the thing that whiteness feels so awfully threatened by. This idea that Black interiority, John, is a threat to white supremacy woke me to a new reality about freedom. That space where we dream, imagine, think, and ponder the world around us is somehow menacing because it is this aspect that defines us as human, and that which defies the horrid historic characterization of Black folk as anything but. I've talked about the sacredness of the interior life, and like you, I teach writing and editing as a craft. Teaching is also a wildly political act when we contemplate the high rates of illiteracy in our country that prevent most from thinking independently, let alone expressing clearly their opinions. Thus, I understand even more the implication of Rizal's radical understanding. The marches and chants are ultimately for the purpose of guarding and defending our inner lives, even as we urge each other to confront and defy that which separates us. After reading his tweet, I began to reflect upon that awful and painful distance between the inner life of Tamir Rice and the officer who killed him, between Ahmaud Arbery and the two men who hunted him down, between George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, whose stance and knees showed how emotionally distant and psychically far he was from the man beneath him. I'll stop there.
It's a hard piece to hear. It must have been a hard piece to write.
It was, and it's a hard piece for me to even read. I was thinking about recently, last month, we learned about another death at the hands of police, Ronald Green. And what struck me, I didn't watch the video, but I did read about it. And what hit me in the heart was when Ronald Green said, "I'm scared, I am your brother." And that "I am your brother" was so poignant because it highlights once again that space I'm talking about. Here is this man who's plea for life is towards someone who doesn't even acknowledge him as an individual. And I think that's part of some of what we need to discuss, how to close that painful gap.
That how to close that painful gap has been one of my obsessions. And one of the tiny tools I've learned, one of the best tools I've learned, or I'm still learning it, trying to learn it, is in conversations, remembering to check with people to make sure I'm clear on their understanding, because we all come from different places and have different experiences. So I don't know what was edited in your piece, but at one point you posed a question to John, and it seemed like you were checking with him. You said, does it bother you like it bothers me that a young Black Lives Matter activist was found dead in Tallahassee, Florida? Why did you ask him that?
I mean, the gorgeous thing about the epistolary form as an essay is that it's so public. So at once it's to him, but also to the reader, much in the same way that Baldwin's letter to his nephew in The Fire Next Time is really to America. And so to some extent, it's of course rhetorical, but it's also a way of me kind of, underscoring the level of fear that we were living with, not just from a pandemic, but what has been, I guess that's what it is, what has been historic. And even the shooting of in Atlanta of Asian Americans struck me as another moment in which we need not be ambivalent about violence in this country as it's targeted towards people of color. And yeah, it was rhetorical, but it was intentional.
I love the way that question also is saying, can it bother you the way it bothers me? And that's what's so beautiful about what you alert us to in terms of the interior space. Is there a way that you can know what I know and even wish to know that? And that's a question one can wrestle with for a good time, to try and live up to the expectation or the possibility of it.
Now I wish I did edit it a little bit more. I think can rather than did or does is the exact question I think is the aim of this anthology, right? Is to kind of reach into that kind of psychic, and for me it is psychic as much as it is physical. I mean, I'm driving cross country right now, and you best believe I'm looking at that 75 miles an hour, right? Because it's a risk, and I don't know how many folks understand the historic nature of that risk. So the can is crucial.
Yeah.
Tracy, would you be willing to read that excerpt from Layli Long Soldier's piece? I mean, I think sort of talking about using can or did or, one of the things that was so striking about her piece is sort of the humility with which she asks the reader to think about the words and what she presents, and also the humility with which she offers understanding, which is the piece you're going to read.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do my best. This is such a beautiful and powerful piece of writing. Horror, fear, anger, terror, outrage, panic. I felt this as I witnessed. Through the pupil to my throat, into my chest. Like an arrow, the images of George Floyd pierced my soul. I have no other way to describe it. I wanted to rage. This country, the structure, if it were a dinner table, I'd flip it. But as I considered how big this structure is, my adrenaline quickly synthesized to poisonous dread. timeless dread, older than you and me dread, from the grave and born again. For days, I could not stop my tears. There was nowhere for this sickly energy to go except back to the source, my eyes. With water and salt, my soul cleanses naturally. But I want to tell you what dread does to me. It makes me feel impotent, like I have no arms or legs, not even a mouth to open, cry out, or bite. But I forgave myself for all those responses, even feeling impotent, because I'm sure it's instinctual. Iron hail could not sleep, neither could I. It's the knowing without words that something is here, more is coming. I've been so shaken. I even asked my teenage daughter, who craves independence, to sleep with me this week. Why? I cling to my child to ensure her safety. I am obliterated emotionally. Why? George Floyd and I, we are from different communities, different backgrounds, different genders. On this land, our histories overlap, but in some ways they are distinct. I have no words for why, though I can say with certainty that George Floyd's murder hit me to my core as if he were my brother, my own, my blood. His death, along with the recent chain of violations and murders of Black people, makes me feel desperate for the respect owed to them. Absolute respect, not one more violation. I must do something, that elder instinct says, but I don't know what, I answer. Forgive me, elder, the only way out of my desperation is to write. And forgive me for the gaps in this essay. There's so much I don't know and much more to include. Though I believe the adage that the pen is mightier than the sword, I also believe that words are meager. For my paradoxes and contradictions, forgive me. But I empty my pockets. Here are personal memories, something from our ancestors' words and Lakota history, knowledge about this land, a nod to our modern day AIM warriors, love for my daughter and family, mention of a pitiful love life, my experience as a woman. It's all that I have. Even if it's meager, I give it to Mr. Floyd, his family, and anyone affected. There's something so mighty about the way that her vulnerability is shared. You know, it functions in a way kind of like what you were talking about, Major, with the question. And even Greg, the way that in your piece, you do this really large and vulnerable thing of mentioning emancipation as it relates to your daughter, even though we've also been thinking about Juneteenth and what emancipation has historically meant to Black people in this country. And putting herself and yourselves in these positions of wanting, knowing how we fall short, but also knowing how we need to close those gaps. That's one of the most compelling, things about the experience of this essay and so many of the other ones in the book.
Yeah, as we talk about the kind of rhetorical tropes and devices and practices, I think it's important, since something I've noticed in all of our work tonight is that we're taking responsibility for our role in America, right? This is not somebody else's problem. This is not somebody else's fault. This is, if there is going to be progress, it is going to be with all of our shoulders at the wheel. And I appreciate this anthology for, not taking the kind of finger pointing position, but an inclusive approach to it.
I also feel like so much of what I've gathered is when you were talking about Juneteenth and the way that it lived in didn't in your perspective growing up, I understand that. And for me, it was like the kind of thing that a relative, an uncle would say, you know, the story of Juneteenth, pull you aside. And so I grew up feeling that so much of our understanding and experience of this country is this, like a backstory, a private story, something your uncle tells you, and you might trust it and you might kind of question a little bit of it. And the work that we are being called upon to do, I think we now understand, requires us to gather up and reconsider everything that we've considered less than urgently central, and to put it to use and to rise to the occasion, of what it represents. And I think that, Layli does that in this really stunning and beautiful way throughout the essay, asking us to listen to historical voices from, Lakota testimony, and then to go back and listen better, because sometimes we have a way of putting history, just in the margins of our mind.
She does that, and parts of her essay are beautiful and parts are just so harrowing to go through. I mean, the book at times is harrowing, but it's also overflowing with beauty and love. Ross Gay gave us "Have I Ever Told You All the Courts I've Loved?" which, I can't tell you how often in a dark moment I think about Ross going through the airport with his tomato plant, and it gives me hope. There's so much sweetness in Nikki Finney's letter to John Robert Lewis. And Tracy, you wrote what is basically a love letter to Black America. Would you read part of it for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
An audience, will do your questions after this.
Okay. I should know the page number that I'm on. Okay, I got it. Yeah, this was my response to John's assignment. He said, write a letter to America. And I thought, God, I've been thinking and trying to be useful to America and talking to what I understand is white America in so many ways throughout this year. And I want to shift the audience a little bit. So I'll just read the first few paragraphs of A Letter to Black America. Dear Black America, we are many things, aren't we? We are hair, God, yes, we are hair, and song and memory. We are a language so deep it has no need for words, and we are words that faint, dart, and wheel like birds. Like James Brown, we feel good. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, we are sick and tired. We are fearsome. We are fire. Like God, we are that we are. I've always felt great freedom in the countless territories making up the realm of Blackness, so many roots to wholeness, so many versions of joy. In Blackness, I am local. In Blackness, I am also distant kin, indigenous and immigrant at once, host and welcome guest. But in the country of America, the physical and psychic territory in which the physical and psychic domain of Black America is situated, we are made to huddle together by force, by the feelings of rage, threat, exhaustion, disappointment, and long suffering that swarm us in this nation that loathes, fears, regrets, and cannot yet fully bear to accept the fact of us. And I hear my uncles saying, tell me something I don't know, with laughter in their throats. And it is that laughter, our laughter, that I cleave to. We revel in the depth and the flair and the belief and the secrecy of Blackness. We are lucky to be who we are, and we know it. And I hear my aunt saying, amen, and their deep intaking of breath, followed by a steep exhalation. Black, we revel in the resourcefulness and the resilience and the poise and the know-how and the grace and the anger and the prayers to all manner of beings that have kept us alive. Alive despite attempt after concerted attempt to annihilate us. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
And I can answer Major's question a little bit, that the answer is yes. I think sometimes we can be with one another's experiences. Maybe it's weird and I don't know how you feel about it, you know, but as a white woman, I feel like I was raised up by Black feminist authors. You know, that was kind of the parenting that I got in my life. And to read about this kind of love, I think, is something that touches, I hope, touches everybody, because it models what love is. It models how to be human, how to take joy, how to appreciate. It's so powerful.
I'm really curious to see, you know, one of the other things that makes me exciting about what can happen when we encounter one another in our fullness on the page, we step into the voice and the breath and the imagination of another person. I feel like so many of the voices in this anthology are saying, okay, now let's stand up. Let's walk outside. Let's be in our bodies and in space in relation to one another. And can we still hold on to that, you know, that sense of fidelity to one another? That's the invitation, I think.
Greg, Major, anything you want to add before I let the audience send their questions?
My favorite moment is the aunt and uncle's varied responses, right? Tell me something I haven't heard before. But that aunt and those generations who, there's a world weariness, but there's also in that deep sigh, I feel an acknowledgement of our generations and subsequent generations' growth into this space. I think Layli, speaking about feeling impotent, many folks, maybe it was the exhaustion of the pandemic, felt really deeply, but did not know what to do. And so feeling debilitated, my response to folks was, I know you feel this. I know the words are not coming. Don't worry, this is a relay race. The tragedy of this is that, and the beauty of it is that calling that you mentioned, so many folks felt called who weren't called before. And that's good too. But something about the aunt and uncle almost bearing witness to our own growth into struggle is such a beautiful aspect of that. You could have said father and mother, but I had something about that avuncular nature and that anti nature in that essay gives it such vibrancy to me.
Yeah, I just pick up on that sense of impotence, and you know that's the opening, right? You know, to call on the language of 12-step programs. You know, it is. We've had. I mean, I recognize that as a nation, we've hit rock bottom many times in the past, but I think as a generational moment, there's a you know, a moment that we are forced to acknowledge that we are helpless in the face of the horror, but also the potential beauty, right? And our language has to shift, and I think that's the listening element of it is part of that vulnerability that we keep underscoring.
I always just keep coming back to the language. I mean, the Major, in your piece, Roselle's idea about interiority just struck me as so profoundly beautiful. And I sat with that for a bit, but then I also thought it was complicated for me by some other things that happened last year, like the death of Elijah McClain, who was this young man with autism who somebody called the police because he was waving his arms as he walked down the sidewalk. he was like dancing, and somebody found his bodily movements disturbing, and then because of the police response and what happened, he died. Same with Christian Cooper. In Central Park, a man was bird watching, and a white woman threatened his life, basically, and because of his sitting on a bench in the park. So, for me, the sort of change making and thinking about systemic change is about protecting interiority and physical lives. There's something so urgent about this time. But also that's why I'm always, I'm not a poet. That's why I'm so grateful to be here with you guys. But I spend a lot of time talking about media literacy because I think it's so essential for everybody to remember with language sort of what it means when we talk about certain things and how other information is always omitted.
Mm-hmm. And that's where Claudia Rankine's work becomes quite useful, thinking about the failure of imagination of those people who are quick to call, or the policemen who cannot see young Black men beyond the narratives that constrain them, or all of us. But that interiority, it's such, I say where we dream, where we imagine, when we can recognize that aspect of each other, that's when we start to see each other as human. And that's what's heartbreaking about it, truly heartbreaking about it.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I was just going to point out the poetry of the moment and the importance of poetry in the moment, to underscore that as well, right? And the way that we're called to pay attention to language in a poem, right, is to understand the etymologies of each word, understand what is being suggested by the combinations of words. And I think that the way that we're trained to think as we move through a poem is very much the kind of thinking we need to be doing as we move through the world, right? Is to recognize that each individual has their own etymology, has their own history, and together we create varying contexts, in collection. And again, just the importance that poetry plays in this moment.
So Denise in the audience has a question, beginning with a thank you to Greg for your admission that Juneteenth wasn't a looming historical event for you until recently. Many people are having a similar moment with the rash of documentaries about the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. So for all of the panelists, are there other events writ large on your consciousness in this moment that are not yet the subject of our collective conversation about race and racism in this country?
That's such a great question.
That is a great question. I think a lot about and this is kind of a dodge on the question, but the ubiquity of horror throughout our history, right? And so we're attending to Juneteenth as a moment. We're attending to the Tulsa Massacre as a moment. But I think there's a way that these moments suggest that what they're made of is momentary and passing, when in fact our history is replete with violences on many different scales. Perhaps Tulsa is an extreme example, but and as we all know, there are horrors that don't get reported, the horrors that are repressed, the horrors that are erased, so I think the important thing for me is getting at the ideology that holds all of this horror together, and again back to this idea of vulnerability, right? And that is, if we can all kind of not presume that we know already what's out there, what's behind us, and what's ahead of us, that we can begin to learn and hear one another.
Well, one of the things that's so obvious about the events like Tulsa is they're suppressed because they incite such understandable shame in the perpetrators and those who descend from that, and that is the strain that we need to address in terms of who we are. I'm thinking even of January 6th and the way that suddenly this is something that is being quieted, dampened, and removed or moved farther away from questions of racism, questions of insurrection, questions of white supremacy. And this is a move that we are seeking or must seek harder to arrest and reverse. I'm so grateful for a book like Evel Ewing's 1919, which talks about the race massacre in Chicago, by looking at a commissioned report and enlarging the interiority that has been sort of erased or never recognized about the lives of the Black people who endured racialized violence simply because they were there.
And the 1619 Project, of course.
Yep. For me, I guess I want to add to that by saying, I wonder what does it mean for us, rather than catalog them, which we need to do, and we need to acknowledge them. What would it mean for us to embrace and understand these tragedies as part of the larger narrative of this country? What, much like the work of the lynchings that are being memorialized across the country, that's a very public act that is meant to that is meant for us to kind of understand the Red Summer of 1919 and moments further back. Do we become less Americans, or do we become more Americans when we embrace that narrative? And how does it kind of make us more beholden to the values that we articulate, those noble goals of all men are created equal? Is it truly a threat for us to embrace it, or is it something that we can live through, think through, embrace, understand the martyrdom and the spiritual dimensions of that martyrdom?
I love that question, Major. Does it make us more, and I would say absolutely, it makes us more American to embrace that history. And Tracy, to your point about the shame, what I find so interesting about that shame, and the impulse to protect children from feeling bad about themselves because of this history, and simultaneously saying, we are not responsible for what happened hundreds of decades and hundreds of years ago, right? There's the mechanics of that shame suggest a kind of identification with, a kind of claiming, right, of parts of the history. So in other words, there's an admission that, well, I really want to hold on to this slice of which ends up very often being white supremacy, right? This slice of history, but I don't want to get hold on to the other parts. And I think absolutely it would be a unifying thing for us to all claim together that this is our history.
Greg, I don't know if you're familiar with Facing History and Ourselves, but it's an organization I love. They've worked for many years to help educators teach children about atrocities in an age-appropriate way. It started to address the Holocaust. More recently, they're working on history of race, because the idea is that if we don't teach our children about it, how can we expect them to learn? But also recognizing that what you're going to teach in a college setting is not necessarily what's appropriate for fifth graders. I think they do amazing work.
Yeah, and so much of that too is bound up. I go to the pronoun I remember saying when the
Right, can
previous
you repeat
occupant
your
of
sentence?
the
You
White
froze
House
for a second.
was in. Oh, sorry. I was saying that I recall when the previous occupant of the White House was in office, whenever he would use that pronoun we, somehow I knew very clearly that I was not included in that we, right? And so part of the work too is figuring out how to communicate a we that genuinely projects an inclusive, right? An invitation, I think, as Trace was saying earlier.
So one specific example, although I'm sorry if you heard me frantically Googling because I couldn't find the name that I wanted to find, but there was a terrible moment in New York, I believe it was in the 60s, when a mentally ill Black woman needed help and police were called. And because she was distraught, they shot and killed her. And this woman had previously done really well in treatment, but she was going through a difficult period. And she had actually written in her diary that she feared one day dying at the hands of police because she had seen other people who were struggling or off medication. And I think someday that will be a moment that we all look at and recognize sort of our collective failing to understand that people who are unwell mentally are no different than everybody else and deserving of understanding for their interiority. And, you know, I hope someday it's sort of a catalyst for wider conversation and language about human rights. So we don't have a lot of time left. I mean, each of you, I want to thank for coming. I wish I could spend an hour with each of you and with each of your pieces. And the other thing that I thought was so amazing that it just, you know, or just interesting that it kept occurring, there was so much talk about parenting and infants and this connection between wanting to protect our offspring and our the relationship between our feelings about them. Maybe to close, Tracy, could you read an excerpt or say whatever you'd like about the title of the book and where that came from?
Oh, sure. I'll read an excerpt because I feel like it bringing us back into that, the voice of love, which is really, I think, anchors the title. In this case, it's Love from a Mother to a Son, Kirsten West Savali's essay on motherhood and ancestral resistance. I'll read these excerpts from the end. It is 5 a.m. now, Walker, and I can't sleep. I hear you in your room laughing and talking to friends you haven't seen in person since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Your baby brothers are nestled against me. I'm on your dad's side of our bed, writing you this letter with his socks on my feet and his wedding ring over my heart. We thought he had more time, that we had more time. We thought he'd be here to raise you into manhood. And I'm terrified that I can't keep you safe. Where in the world is safe for you, my beautiful, beautiful boy? These are a mother's fears. There's a revolution outside, my love. And as empires and tears fall, you need to know that you come from a tradition of Mississippi warriors who have resisted despair's siren song and remixed it until it sounded like freedom. You need to know that, yes, one day you may feel like that. And I'm so sorry that I can't protect you from it all. You may grieve and mourn and scream from the depths of your soul, as so many of our people are doing now, not just in streets across this country and around the globe, but in bedrooms and around kitchen tables where there are no cameras or lights or hashtags. If that should happen, baby, I promise you this, you will see your pain in others as I see my pain in you. You will see your power in others as I see my power in you. And now, right now, I call on all of our ancestors to guide my steps in such a way that I'm still alive to love you through it. I'll stop there.
Let's unmute and clap, okay? Because
Okay, we'll
we
clap
need
for
to.
everyone.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, everybody at Greenlight Books. And I hope you all order a copy or 10 from Greenlight Books and give it to your friends, because it really, I think people are going to be reading this for a long, long time, like 100 years from now, because it really captures the moment in a way nothing else I've seen yet has. So thank you. And thank you, Tracy and John, who we don't see on the screen, but is here. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks, Julie. Thanks,
Yes.
Major. Greg.
Thank you all so much for an incredible conversation. As Julie said, please buy this wonderful anthology. You can find that book buy link in the chat, buy online for in-store pickup or shipping anywhere in the US, or you can find it in our stores if you're local to Brooklyn. Thank you so much again, everyone, for sharing the space for conversation and connection with us tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.